Welcome back to 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers and F-Series, America's best-selling truck for 48 years and the official truck of the Boston Red Sox. Tom Caron is still sipping Mai Tais in an episode of The White Lotus, and so as he wields a tiny little umbrella, I'm Alex Speier of the Boston Globe, joined this week by my good friend, former Globe colleague, and now CBS sports writer, Julian McWilliams. Julian, how you doing?
I'm well. How are you doing, Alex?
I am
All's good in
fantastic,
my
trying
way.
not to roast. Trying not to roast
I
and
know.
trying to make sense of strange times in the lives of in the life of the Red Sox, man. What's been what I mean? We haven't talked since the Devers trade went down. We have talked separately about it, but let's not even talk about the trade. Like, tell me what you're seeing on the field from the Red Sox since the trade.
Oof, I mean, that's a lot. Obviously, I think that the fundamentals are still lacking. I mean, you go back to even last night's game with Hamilton and the bunt, and he couldn't get the bunt down. And I was listening. That was funny. I was listening to the Angels broadcast. They were like, "He's a great bunter, and he's going to get this bunt." I was like, I don't know about that. I think you guys just saw a one-off that one night before, and he didn't get the bunt down. And then he grounds into a double play, and that sort of was the game there. Then you look at the offense. The offense, I don't want to talk about Rafi not being there, but it's evident that this team has issues scoring runs. And hopefully that might change when Bregman's back, but there's really no replacing that guy. And I just always come back to that because even seeing him on the San Francisco side, like those teams are kind of similar in some sense of, well, I think San Francisco's better fundamentally, but like from a lineup perspective, there really aren't any guys that in that lineup that you go like, wow, okay, we have to like Chapman can pop one here or there, but there's not consistently, right? And I think you look at Rafi in that lineup, it's like, holy crap, like he makes everybody else that much better in some sense, or just looks that much better. And I think the offensive part is really, really concerning for me. And then the Duran piece of it as well. I know they say it's a matchup thing, but I'm sure as a player, when it's going through your head, when you're DHing and the rookies playing your position, and you're getting moved down to the 5 spot while he's hitting in the 3 hole, and or you're not playing, you're getting benched one game. That sort of stuff is like, okay, what's going on here? Like, am I out of the road? Am I not out of the, in good standing with the team, or what's going on here? So I think there are a lot of things. And then the Cora, like, I didn't understand that play. Like, and I looked it up, and you have a right to I guess rule wise to block the bag if you have possession of the ball.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure what if he's sort of on edge right now. So it just seems to be a lot going on. And then I don't want to mention the Bueller thing because I don't think I've ever seen that. So it's a lot of chaos, as we've talked about, Alex. It's chaos to me. Even in the winning, there seemed to be some chaos.
Well, it's a super interesting form of winning, right? Because it's a form of winning that isn't necessarily the most successful. They did a really quite remarkable job of playing very well this month through the Devers trade, and then beyond that through the Seattle series before they lost 2 of 3 in San Francisco. Then they lost the first 2 then they lost the first 2 in Anaheim. But it was like they were winning despite their offense. 6 wins in a month when you score 3 runs or less is not a sustainable formula for winning. Like, no one wins on a consistent basis that way. So you're kind of waiting for you're kind of waiting for the pendulum to swing, and we kind of saw it swing in the first couple of games, especially the extra innings game in Anaheim, when it's like, okay, you tried to win 1-0 behind Garrett Crochet, and like, this is the margin for error. There is none, right? Like, there's
Right.
all of these
Yeah.
1-run moments, and like there probably was going to inevitably be some correction with the Red Sox really poor performance in 1-run games this year, right? Like, when they were losing 3 out of 4 1-run games, that wasn't going to be who they were all year. They were going to start winning some close games, but to rely on winning close games as your path to contention, that's a harder one. And certainly to rely on it at a time when you have so much learning going on. And you mentioned the fundamentals, that's part of it. When you mention young players trying to learn how to be offensively consistent. Like you see Marcelo Meyer, even in a great game for him, right? Like he has 3 hits in the same game, has the triple, has a run scoring hit, and like delivers an RBI single in extra innings, but at the same time took 3 fastballs like over the play, like that were squarely in the strike zone in a called strikeout. Like that was, there's a lot of learning going on, and so your margin for error is so narrow. I don't know. I'm kind of with you. Like I think so much relies on the offense right now.
Yeah, and certainly, I think when you throw like the younger guys in those situations too, because I think the night before against Reed Detmers, when they didn't pinch hit for Ref Snyder in that situation, they kept Anthony in there, and he
Mm-hmm.
just looked young. He just looked young. Like I mean, he
Right.
was jumpy. It looked like the moment was a little bit fast for him, and that's okay. But I think this is when you need those buffers in the lineup for guys like Pedroia to come up and be, hey, I'm okay struggling a little bit here because I have Ortiz, or and they don't really have that. You have a lot of guys like Story who's been playing well as of late, but he's trying to get his feet under him still after seemingly not playing for like 3 years. You have Duran who's struggling. You have Bregman who's out. So a lot of these younger guys are just put in positions where they're the guys who have to make sure they're winning every night. And that's a lot of pressure. And I think that's unfair pressure in a sense. And then again, if you go to the pitching side of it, I think the Houck thing is kind of concerning for me, Alex. I know he's not here yet, but if you look at what his numbers were last night, it's like, and they've been like that since spring training. So, it's not necessary. You have a pretty large sample that you can go off of. I know he's worked himself back, but I'm just wondering what's going on there. And because he was supposed to be a huge part of this team. And I think had he put up his first half numbers this year, I think they could account for probably a few more wins for the Red Sox. I just think they're missing that second guy who can go out there and say, okay, I may not dominate a start by Crochet, but I can at least leave the game with 3 runs on the board to give the offense a chance.
Right. I think the question becomes like in the post Devers realm, who are the anchors, right? And Crochet clearly is one. He's been unbelievable. I mean, he's a force
Like
to
Cy
watch
Young
on the mound.
conversation. Like,
Yeah, yeah. He's
I mean,
he's elite in everything they hoped for, right? So
mm-hmm.
that's a good starting point. But even having one kind of like roster anchor is usually inadequate. Bad teams can have one good player, or mediocre teams can have one really great player. You usually need a couple of guys, and so you mentioned kind of there's a lot of switching around. There's line changes that happen with the lineup, and the left right thing. Whereas with Devers, he was going to be in there. He was hitting number 2 against righties, against lefties. He was literally in the lineup every day, and he was having a fantastic season against lefties, performing as well as he ever had, from a balance standpoint against both sides of the plate. And so I do think that there's been an element of destabilizing that's happened with their entire roster, like with how that entire lineup works together. When you don't have when you're willing to pinch hit for your when you're willing to move your leadoff guy down to 5th in the lineup, depending on matchups, or to have him sit out, when you're willing to have your number 3 hitter be either pinch hit for or moved up and down in the lineup or sitting, it's hard to establish continuity, right?
Yeah, and Alex, I was looking at like something that popped across my feed the other day, and it was like want to learn how to win a World Series and not score runs. And it was a picture of Tim Lincecum, Madison Bumgarner, and I think Matt Cain. And I'm like, they had an identity, and Buster Posey as well. And like it's like the identity like sort of matters. I think if you're not gonna be a good hitting team, you better be able to pitch, right? You better be able to play defense. And the Giants always did that in those years when they were winning World Series. I mean, they pitched and they played defense, and they got the big hits when they needed to, and they went on and won what 3 World Series in 6 years, I believe it was. So I think like just the Red Sox lack of identity. They're not pitching, not like the hitting. Okay, well, it's a bunch of platoon guys. Like if you're a leadoff batter, and this is no disrespect to those guys, they're really good at what they do. But I think if like your leadoff batter is like a platoon guy, like Ref Snyder's, oh well, he hits lefties well, and then you have a 4th hitter's like, oh well, he hits lefties well. I don't see that as a recipe for being something sustainable for a long-term season, even though they hit lefties really, really well. I think you want those like Cora always talks about structure. He likes structure. I like having my eighth inning guy, my ninth inning guy. Well, I like having my leadoff hitter and my four hitter.
Yeah, so I think that like there are a few things that we're just at the roughly halfway point of the season, right? Red Sox go 40 and 41 through the first half of the schedule, so slightly below 500, which does lend itself to these conversations about identity of a team and of what their path is to winning. And I feel like this is a team that needs to basically be different in the second half of the season, obviously, in order to thrust itself into realistic contention, because 80 and 82 ain't doing it over the course of a season. So so you can see, like, if you're trying to identify a path. Okay, so Crochet, that's an anchor. Lucas Giolito has I think shown some promise. Lucas Giolito and Brian Bayo have both shown like promise
Sure.
of, if they can build on what they've been doing over the last couple of weeks, then that would be incredibly significant for the Red Sox if they are able to establish themselves with an identity of pitching. But there's still going to be a question about their ability to withstand the bullpen attrition as the season progresses. Jordan Hicks's health is going to be a significant thing to monitor. Offensively, you have maybe Bregman coming back, and you probably Bregman in the first half of July, let's say. Like, that would be
Mm-hmm.
a guy who's able to kind of stabilize things a bit in the order. But the questions about, can Jarren Duran establish consistency? Can Roman Anthony, in the middle of his rookie season, take the next step forward? Do you think that this team has a realistic path to see some of those parts progressing, where it can thrust itself back into being a team that is in contention at the deadline and can make the moves to support that?
I certainly think they can be in contention. I think a lot of it has to do with the league around them too, right? I think even when you're looking at a team like the Yankees, I don't think they'll probably catch the Yankees. The Yankees have lost their last 9 of 12 games, so there is a link. Cleveland's like 39 and 38. I looked up their record, and I think the Red Sox might be a half a game behind them, or if not like tied. And you got the Angels there who are tied with the Red Sox 2.5 games out. So there's certainly a path. I'm just wondering if in the end it's almost like the heavyweight boxer, right? Like, that, okay, like this guy's hanging around, but eventually he's gonna knock them out, right? Like, and I think with the Yankees, like they're eventually they're going through this right now, but they're eventually gonna take off again. And I don't know if that type of streak is in there for the Red Sox because of all the flaws that are there. I think they have to figure these things out in terms of just even their rookies, like you said. Like, I think it's a lot of wear and tear. You saw even sit down Rafael last year. I think part of his chase was just he was burnt out. Like, the kid was burnt out by the time he got to September. Like, I think in your focus goes down, your attention to detail goes down because it's every single day. Like you said on the Netflix series, you said every single day. So like that every single day thing wears on you. And then you look at somebody like Marcelo Meyer. I think he has to play more than 120 games in a year, and then you're
Oh,
gonna have
hasn't
to
played
ask him
100. Hasn't played
hasn't
100
played
yet.
100.
So like, yeah, because of the
Okay,
injuries, he
yeah.
never hit triple digits in terms of his workload.
So yeah, I'm just thinking about the mental grind of all of it. Like, it's like the marathon part of it. It's like, well, yeah, sure, you can look good for the first 15 and maybe even struggle in that first 15, but then your youth is able to power you through that. But what do you look at by like mile 23, 24, when it's just about keeping your wind and your mechanics? Like, I don't know if the Red Sox can necessarily keep those things in order because they have so many young guys trying to learn on the fly.
Yeah, fascinating point, especially when you consider not only Meyer, who's going to be pushing against career highs in number of games played, probably by early August, but also when you think about Carlos Narvaez, who all of a sudden, after
I
having
know.
the very measured workload of a minor league catcher, hello, you're in in a big league lineup all the time, at the most exhausting position. And he's been one of their, he had been one of their best hitters. And so if that goes backwards, then again, you're looking at something that would contribute to the destabilization of the upper part of the lineup. It's a very tricky balancing act, and it's part of the reason why teams that do want to build around youth typically, it's why they've signed Bregman in the first place, right? Like, because you want to have that kind of supporting scaffolding in order to be able to help carry and anchor a team beforehand. And so it's a very challenging thing for the Red Sox. Story is also like, he's going to be facing a workload that he hasn't experienced since 2021. There's a lot of for a lot of people who are going to have to be adjusting on the Red Sox.
Yeah. Are there any teams that you've covered that had like those younger players who sort of had to take on the workload of everything of the years that you've covered the Red Sox?
There have been some fascinating teams that kind of gelled in a way that surprised me and worked and happened more quickly than I would have expected. So, for instance, the 2015 Red Sox, even though they finished in last place, 78 and 84, they kind of cleared the path by getting rid of some veterans at the trade deadline. They got rid of Mike Napoli, they got rid of Shane Victorino, and just kind of opened the path for a lot of young players to play every day. And all of a sudden, that the fact that there were no expectations, there was kind of a freedom to play that allowed a lot of them to look incredible down the stretch that year and really set the foundation for the Red Sox to begin a cycle of contention starting in 2016. So they surpassed my expectations. In the 2022 Orioles were another team that was anchored by Adley Rutschman, right? Like, that was a team that looked like it was just kind of sputtering along. And then Adley Rutschman, who had been injured for the start of the season, shows up, and along with a number of other talented young players, it's like, oh, wait a second, like they're coming. And they really, because they were, I think maybe because they were moving as a pack rather than individually, they really managed to catch their stride as the season progressed. The 2023 Diamondbacks, who surprised everyone by reaching the World Series, were another team that, despite its youth, ended up kind of playing with a kind of freedom where they were able to, in lockstep, although they also had very good veterans like Ketel Marte, for instance. But a lot of them were able to find their footing at once. It can happen. It's just hard to me, it's just hard to predict that that's going to happen.
Right. And I think at least one side of that has to go well. Cause if I do remember correctly, like the Diamondbacks pitching staff was really good that year, right? Weren't they? Or they were.
Yeah, well, they had some terrific contributors from like Zack Gallen and Merrill Kelly and others showing up to really help them. So yeah, you're right. Like, the Red Sox, in order to contend, are going to need things to happen in the second half that didn't necessarily happen on a consistent basis in the first half. What did happen in the first half was a landmark trade that changed the shape of the organization, and one that the Red Sox, frankly, weren't, not one of their choosing necessarily. When you drew it up on paper, they did not enter the season saying, we're going to trade Rafael Devers at the first opportunities that we have to do so. No, like they wanted Alex Bregman and Rafael Devers as this back-to-back force in the middle of the lineup, and the fact that they don't have it,
Alex.
Yeah.
Good.
It was. I really thought that they were going to be an elite offense in mid to late May. They looked like they had a chance to be really, really good.
Yeah, like it just looked like, oh crap! Like, this is. Like, you had one guy who was just like, I remember Xander said it about Rafi one time. He was like, dude, it's just the fear factor that he brings. Like, it's like the swings, like the violence, the ability to hit outside the zone. And he was like, obviously his plate discipline is like elite now, but like the ability to just do whatever he wants with the baseball. It's like, it's incredible when it comes to swinging the bat. Like, it's incredible. And it's just like, I'm looking on the other side now. I'm like, oh, geez, I watch that every day. Geez, I took it for granted. Oh no, it's like the girl that gets away, and you're just like, oh no, I loved her.
So absence speaks the heart profounder in some respects. In some respects, I mean, and there were reasons for this. There were reasons for this trade to happen that obviously we'll get into. But as we discussed the lineup being destabilized, some of that is a reflection of this has been a tumultuous time for the Red Sox, and trading Devers is a part of that. the aftermath of the Devers trade, which has been filled with some controversy and and reports about like the state of the Red Sox front office, unflattering portraits of the state of the Red Sox front office. That's also been part of it. So, in order to try to digest all of that, we are going to be joined after the break by Zack Scott of Four Ring Sports Solutions, a 17-year member of the Red Sox front office who also spent a year as an acting GM of the Mets, to take stock of where the Red Sox and what it means to be an organization dealing with a bit of chaos. That'll be right after the break on 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers. And welcome back to 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers. We are joined now by Zack Scott of Four Ring Sports Solutions, a longtime member of the Red Sox front office and also former acting GM of the Mets. Zack, you experienced a lot of success with the Red Sox. That's why you work that's why your company is called Four Rings. At the same time, you endured a lot of chaos in the Red Sox front office. So tell me what's that like to be inside of that front office bubble at a time when the outside perception is that the world is kind of crumbling.
Yeah, there are definitely ups and downs. Even when we were performing on the field, there was some drama going on behind the scenes, and a lot of that would end up becoming public. The way that I dealt with it and others dealt with it was to just focus on the job at hand, right? So things that were out of our control, we just had to focus on doing the best job that we can. But it's hard, and it creates stress and anxiety and uncertainty when it comes to, examples like the time Theo left in the gorilla suit, and we had 40 days of kind of being a little rudderless and people trying to do their best, but it was kind of all over the place. The whole 2011 collapse and all the controversy that came out of that, and then again Theo leaving, Tito being fired, and all that stuff. I mean, there was always a lot of change. Obviously, they hire a new head of baseball ops every 4 years or so lately, and that's hard. I went through several transitions, and you just do your best to do your job and kind of take care of the people around you, because everyone's going through it together.
When you are getting those, you mentioned like hiring the different GMs every 4 years, which has been pretty on brand for the Red Sox. And from a person who's like been in the front office, and then you have different people coming in, say like the Red Sox have transitions from Dombrowski to Heim to now Craig. How do you sort of, as a person that has been through all those hires and been through the system for that long, how do you navigate all of that, all those different voices?
Well, I think you have to start by going into it with a positive mindset that, this is the person that's in charge. We're going to make the best of it. Everyone has a different style. We're going to get to know that person, try to learn what's important to them, how we can support them, and then try to execute on that. Usually, you hope the person comes in with a vision that they can clearly communicate what they want in the operation and how they want people to function in their roles. And some people are better at that than others. And so, sometimes you got to improvise if you don't have that clarity, and just kind of try to figure out what's best for the organization. So ultimately, in a lot of those, I was fairly senior, especially the last couple, Chaim and Dave. And so it was my role to make sure the people that reported to me and that team was, doing their best work, working towards the common goal. And a good thing about working in sports is you always know what the mission is, right? It's fairly straightforward, unlike some other companies. So, we just wanted to do what we could do to help the team out the most.
When you think about the culture change that goes into structural change, right? Like when you change a head of baseball operations, there's going to be changes to how a lot of jobs are functioning. How do you approach? How does an executive, how does a chief baseball officer or a president of baseball operations, like what are kind of is it necessary to kind of have intentional team building exercises? I don't know if you're going out for trust falls, but like what goes into the process of creating in this, it's a competitive landscape that you're in, right? Like people are in it because they want to be part of winning. So there's that kind of like interesting shared mindset to it. How do you go about what are kind of typical team and culture building activities that foster trust in the changes that are going on?
Honestly, it's as simple as just having genuine, open conversations with as many people as possible. You want to build those relationships. So, when I went to the Mets and I didn't have a lot of relationships already in place there, it was me. It was COVID time, so it was mostly over Zooms rather than in face to face. But it was really trying to get to understand what everyone was about, what their strengths and weaknesses were, what they saw that was working, what wasn't working. And I think on the other side of it, when new leaders came in, that's what they were trying to do mostly. But it's really about communicating as much as you can to really get a feel for how people operate and what they bring to the table.
When you're not aligned, though, like when you're sort of going to a situation and say you're in a position where you might think one thing, the other guy thinks another, and you're really, really like adamant about what you feel, and sort of like this is like, I wouldn't say a non-negotiable, but like it's something that you truly believe in, but the other
Yeah.
isn't necessarily doesn't believe that. How does that make the job less enjoyable, or do you just see it as something that's a challenge?
I think it can make it frustrating. I mean, if you feel strongly about something or a direction, and then you're going in the opposite direction, I think that's going to be frustrating because you feel strongly about it. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to have alignment. I've always said to people, we don't have to have agreement, but we have to have alignment. Which the difference being, there may be a decision on investing heavily in a player, signing a player that maybe I disagree with. But if the GM says, I understand that you disagree with this, I've heard you, you've had your chance to be heard, and then says, but I need your support on this. We're going to do this and we're going to go forward and we need to make it work. That's the kind of communication that I think smooths things over and gets people on the same page.
So alignment is obviously like the major word, right? Because it was used 14 times, I believe, in the conference call that featured Craig Breslow and Sam Kennedy coming out of the Rafael Devers trade. It's an interest. Like alignment is one thing within a front office, right? Where throughout a baseball operation, where ultimately it's really important for the messaging to be very consistent across an organization. Otherwise, just chaos, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the case of alignment with the player, how important is that, and how much is that a reflection? Is that a reflection on the you had the Manny Ramirez experience for many years? Do you have to? Is alignment more important than talent, or or when there's misalignment, do you just kind of make it work?
Well, I think obviously talent's important. I was very junior in the Manny Ramirez years, so I didn't have to deal too much directly with it, but I was around it and, absorbing any of the stress that my bosses were feeling or having to deal with. And I was observing what they were dealing with. And it was very complicated and very challenging. But I think, both are important, talent and alignment. You need to have proactive communication. And I think that's when organizations get in trouble with, and this is not just the Red Sox, this is any team, any business, is when they're not trying to get ahead of things and realize we have to, it's not a bad thing if we over communicate, but it's a horrible thing if you under communicate. So having conversations as early as possible about issues that may arise, I think is key, even though sometimes I know people are like, I don't want to have the conversation that may be difficult unless I have to have that conversation. I think that's rolling the dice a little bit, and you have to try your best to be proactive. And sometimes you may have conversations that are unnecessary, but what's the harm in doing that? There's real harm when there's a lack of communication.
Zach, I find this interesting. I was speaking to not to get off topic, but I was speaking to a player probably about 2 weeks ago. He used to play for the Oakland A's, and he's probably jumped around the league a little bit. And he says, dude, like the A's are the least analytical team I've ever played for. And I found that so fascinating because they were sort of like the introduction to it, right?
Right.
How have you seen the analytics sort of shift as from the time it was brought into the Red Sox system to basically now?
Yeah, I mean, when I started there, I was probably the only full-time person with an analytics background. We had Bill James, who was a consultant. Eventually, we brought on my old boss, Tom Tippett, first as a consultant and eventually full-time. But I was really the only full-time person that had a background in statistics. And at the same time, we were probably ahead of the curve back then in 2004 because our GM really valued that work and wanted to apply it, which was the key thing. You could have all the all the information and all of these analytical tools. But if you don't know how to use it, they're all kind of useless. But I think, we quickly fell behind once teams like the Rays started, and Andrew Friedman, I think in like 2006 became the GM there, and they started investing heavily in that. Like we definitely stayed the same for a while. And if you're not getting better, you're often getting worse. And so we didn't really start investing more in that space until a lot later, like really 2013, 2014, and then really a lot in 2015, 16 and beyond. But I think it's funny you mentioned Oakland, because I see it the same way where, they have a very small analytics group, one of the smallest in the league, but yeah, they started out, they were the Moneyball team, right? So they're in a large way introducing it. But really, if you think about that book and movie, how it was really that Billy and Paul DePodesta were using that information to actually make decisions. So, and back then we didn't have as much information, right? Like I have said in the past that we went from, when I started, it was like 10,000 data points to 10 billion data points when you start factoring in all the biomechanical information that we now have. And so it was mostly box score level data that we had. We had some pitch by pitch, but it wasn't to the level that we have today. So you were somewhat limited, focusing on outcomes more than what today you can do is kind of keep taking steps back from outcomes. So first it's the pitched ball, the ball once it's released from the hand. Now we know what happens before it's released from the hand, what happens before a guy swings the bat, when he swings the bat, and after he makes contact. You can really tell the whole story of what's going on in the field, obviously tracking defensive players as well. We didn't have all that stuff, so we had to come up with creative and much more flawed ways with a lot of assumptions baked in to try to evaluate defense. We in 2004 made the famous Nomar Garcia-Parra trade, and a lot of that was based on our defensive analysis and what we were seeing as well, obviously. But it was risky at the time to be putting a lot of weight on defensive numbers because they had some flaws, but we understood the limitations, so we could use it effectively.
So the explosion of all of that analytical information, though, right, like has created these fascinating structural tensions inside of a number of front offices, including, including the Red Sox, based on what we're seeing from the Devers trade itself, like, seems like in some ways a reflection of where, again, that question of alignment and how the ability to see eye to eye from the front office perspective and the field perspective. And then in the aftermath, we're seeing these articles about, like, we're seeing reports that are, that reflect a kind of common talking point about the Red Sox being having been over the last, not even just with Craig Breslow, but even for years beyond that, an organization that has struggled to balance, the human element with analytical models and with model building. So when there's that kind of sense of a communication gap, like, where does an organization go from that? It does this when you see reports like, the widespread story about the Red Sox firing a scout who said a very unflattering thing about Craig Breslow on a hot mic at the end of a Zoom, that kind of reflects a tension that exists in the organization related to that, like, to that question of, like, how is analytical information weighted versus more traditional perspectives. Where does an organization go from that? Like, it's one thing, you talked at the beginning about approaching structural change and alignment. Where do you go in the middle of a crisis? How does an organization handle that?
Well, again, it comes back to communication, creating opportunities to really just put our cards on the table and talk through these difficult things. And, when you start talking about jobs at stake, right? Like, what happened in baseball was, in the last 10 years or so, this exponential increase in hiring of mostly analytics people, software developers, data scientists, data engineers, and biomechanical engineers, all these things that are more quantitative. The number of jobs increased dramatically. I mean, the average baseball team has, probably higher than 25 people in that space, with some teams in the 40s as far as full-time employees. And, some teams just increase their overall investment in baseball ops, and other teams, they cut in other areas. And a lot of times it was, pro scouting, for example. And so that does create a tension when people's jobs and livelihoods are at stake, which is totally understandable. So I think that's crucial to, be empathetic to the situation and how it's affecting other people in different ways, and to address it and to have these conversations and to be as transparent as possible so people understand the why. You still have to do what you think is best for the organization. And if that's what you think is best, at least explain. I think you owe it to people to explain why you're doing this, why you think it's best, while still being empathetic to how it may be affecting their lives.
Have you, in your time, obviously, have you ever had situations where, I don't know, where like a scout or somebody sort of vehemently disagreed with the GM to a point where it's, he might have lost his job?
I haven't seen quite the same example that just came up with the Red Sox scout. And don't worry, Alex, I won't say that about you at the end of this recording. But
you wouldn't be the first.
I mean, I've heard stories. We actually hired someone that got fired from an organization for accidentally. This was back in the days where we still used office voicemail systems, and they sent a voicemail complaining about the organization and the GM, and they accidentally sent it to everyone in the whole organization, and he got fired. And we benefited because he was a really good employee for a long time. He still may actually be there. I'm not even sure. But yeah, no, and I haven't seen it. I actually had, when I was with the Mets, one of my first, everything was on Zoom, like I said, because of COVID. I first came on as assistant GM and had oversight of player development and analytics. And I did a big Zoom with everyone in player development. And at the end of that, I don't know if the Mets used to have these very veteran senior guys as kind of special assistants. They had about a handful of these guys that were maybe in their 80s. And one of the guys at the end of the call did the same thing, but it was much more positive. And he just said, he turned to someone, I don't know if it was his spouse or whoever, but just said, hey, he's not as bad as I thought he would be. Which I laughed. I thought that was funny. I guess it could have gone south, but even if it did, I would have, addressed it, but I'm not sure. People make mistakes, and it's not ideal for sure, and it needs to be addressed. Firing, that's a little extreme, but it is what it is, I guess.
Well, so I guess, I'm interested in your perspective on someone who is, sitting outside of this, but you the Boston landscape, the major market landscape. Like, is this a Boston thing? Like, that this is, that you have a prominent player who's traded, and it ends up mushrooming him into a conversation about the state of an organization and the state of leadership. Is this a reflection of kind of unavoidable tensions that exist in a highly scrutinized market? Do you look at this and think like, oh, this seems like a nothing burger, or do you look at it and say, oh, this is a something burger?
I think it's a combination of the fishbowl of Boston is unlike even New York, because New York has so much going on. There's, I remember David Wells saying that playing in New York was much easier than playing in Boston because he could ride his bike around New York City, and it's big, and there's way bigger celebrities than him out and about in New York City. And in Boston, the athletes are really kind of, Tom Brady was the biggest superstar back then. And it's just harder. He'd get stopped all the time. And so I think there's a focus unlike any other place. And so people care about every little detail that happens, and any mistake that's made gets magnified, talked about kind of 24/7 on the news cycle, the media cycle. And it is what it is. But I do think there's too much of a pattern here for it not to be related to the Red Sox. There've been, unfortunately, too many times where people have left the organization, and there've been, comments leaking out that are negative. And it's, I've talked to multiple people that's happened to, and they feel like that's just kind of the MO of the Red Sox, which is a tough reputation to have. And especially when you don't really know where these things are coming from. I mean, I felt like I experienced it myself on a much smaller scale because I'm a nobody. So it wasn't a public thing, but, I'd talked to people that I was friends with at the Red Sox, and they talk about how I left on bad terms to go to the Mets, which couldn't be further from the truth. I called pretty much everyone in the organization and thanked them for the opportunity and the experience and everything over the years. But somehow it became that I left on bad terms, which just boggled my mind. And I talked to some other people who are like, yeah, I don't know why. It just seems to be how it happens. I don't know if they get offended that people leave the organization ever, but it's too bad because it's a great place to be. It loved my 17 years there. But it is something that it's happened way too often for it not to be something that's also Red Sox related.
Is that something though, like that is so when it is going on, and you mentioned the media cycles and sort of it just everything just being in a fishbowl and everybody paying attention to you. You know, I even bring up the fact of like, gosh, I couldn't imagine like how it is for a player to be here because I don't even want to walk into a bar and tell people what I do because they'd be like, oh, what's Rafael Devers like? And it's just all they talk about is baseball, and it's like I can't do it, right? I just can't do it right now because that's
Yeah.
all I think about nonstop. I'm just trying to get a beer here.
Mhm.
So, but like when you're in those
It's true.
situations and the media cycle's constantly talking about it, it's a constant reminders all over Boston. Is that something that you guys as a front office feel? And does it ever? Yeah, is it something that you all feel?
Yeah, I think, you know, I grew up in the area. I grew up a Red Sox fan. It's all I knew for a long time, right? Until I went to the Mets, it was the only organization I had worked for. A lot of the people, especially when I first started, were from the area as well and were passionate Red Sox fans. So we kind of knew, right? We knew the psyche, especially pre '04 psyche of Red Sox fans. Um, and then it kind of changed a little bit to be a little bit more because of the success of the Patriots and Celtics and Bruins and Red Sox. It became a little bit more like Yankees fans, where there's some entitlement there and expectations of winning. And if you didn't, it was a little harsher reaction than there used to be. I think you just know it. I mean, you'll hear people say it's noise that you have to deal with and have to be able to tune out. I think that's true. When I was in the brief time I was in the GM seat at the Mets, I wasn't on Twitter. I had to avoid that stuff because there was only downside to knowing what people were saying. And I've known people that have been in that seat at the Red Sox that did pay too much attention to it. And you see it start to creep into some of the things they're talking about. And so it's really important to take measures to make sure you're not being influenced by that, not becoming emotional about it, not focusing on, because when you do that, you might be focusing more on your job security than what's best for the organization. And so, yeah, there's a challenge like that. And I think most of the people are aware of it. I'm sure there's been people. I remember when Dave came on, he thought he knew what to expect. And he pretty early on was like, whoa, it's way more intense than I even expected. And so that was interesting to get that perspective because, again, that was all I really knew.
That's wild to think about Dave Dombrowski, like, being, admittedly seeing something that he had not experienced before. But I guess, along those lines, it is, you saw a lot. You have seen a lot of things in baseball, and you have seen a lot of things with the Red Sox. The one thing that I step back on as I look at this, like, this is obviously a hard organizational moment. They had to trade away a franchise player because he very publicly, made, kind of aired his differences from the organization, and then went to another organization and immediately said, I'll do anything you want. So
Right.
there was a pretty rapid transformation that doesn't look great for the Red Sox. I think back to times like, 2012 was catastrophically bad for the Red Sox, right? Like, I can only imagine, like we were talking a little bit before going on, like, 2005 when Theo left the organization in the gorilla suit, that was chaos, and yet it was kind of like a somewhat compressed chaos, right? Like, in terms of
Right.
duration. The 2012 season was the one that was most drawn out of any of them. There were other times, whether it was the transition of Ben to Dave, whatever, where things looked crazy in Boston. And then you think about like 2012 into 2013, like the cultural shift and the ability to achieve cultural alignment after misalignment was pretty rapid. So I guess in your
Yeah.
experience, like, yeah, are problems like these that seem cultural fixable? Should they be viewed as like, should they be viewed as like, once they're going, you can't get it? Or are these things fixable? Should the Red Sox be seen as kind of being, as being an organization that has an opportunity to gain its footing maybe in the aftermath of this incident?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's lessons to be learned, right? I mean, you gave a good example, right? If you look at it from 2007, each year we got worse, right? Like, we went from getting knocked out early in the playoffs to not making the playoffs to having an epic collapse in 2011 to a big change in 2012 and kind of hitting rock bottom at the time. And so we decided that, we had some cultural issues back to 2011. We had some cultural issues in 2012. So we made the decision that we need to focus on bringing in good cultural influences and focused on doing that aggressively in the offseason. And it was successful. And they were also propelled by kind of a galvanizing tragic incident in 2013 that brought everyone on the team and the community together, and people had career years, and we won the World Series. But the very next year, a lot of those same guys, because we had success, went back to thinking more about, oh, well, I'm in my contract year. I only had a 2-year deal. It's, it becomes more about yourself and not about the team. And we had more cultural issues that year. So these things can go up and down. Part of it is, definitely related to how you're performing on the field. It's everyone's happier when you're playing well, but having cultural issues can also result in poor play on the field. And so I think with this incident, and again, I don't have inside knowledge to it, but just looking at it from the outside in, I mean, it was, in some ways it was predictable when going back to the offseason, when you saw comments being anonymous sources saying things like, Alex Cora and Sam Kennedy want Bregman, but Breslow and his people don't. I mean, that was to me at least a yellow flag, if not a red flag, that there wasn't alignment, that magic word. And to me, that was something that they needed to get ahead of right away. And it seems like, for whatever reason, it didn't happen. And there wasn't proactive communication with the player. They were talking publicly about Bregman as a second baseman, which also, again, was kind of a yellow flag, that it wasn't really being communicated what the intentions were. And I hope that anytime you make mistakes, and I've made mistakes, everyone makes mistakes, that you learn from them and you make an adjustment and realize that this is something that we need to invest time in. And I think what's hard for people in the fast-paced, high-stakes world of sports is to actually carve out time to invest in things that people might view as softer skills, right? Or just soft, the relationship building, the communication. We're in such a focus on getting the right players, getting the most out of our players, creating systems and processes to do those things, that we sometimes forget that we have to develop human relationships with everybody in the organization. And that's a lot of the best organizations thrive because everyone's on the same page about what's expected from them and how they're going to do things. And that's a key thing that I think people kind of, even at the highest levels of ownership, when they're hiring GMs, they kind of ignore it and just think that it's really just who can make the best decisions on putting a roster together. And it's like, well, what drives that is a lot more that's going on with the people underneath and the way that things are communicated and where the ideas are coming from. And so I think, we tend to just put that aside sometimes.
Well, lessons learned from a moment of change for the Red Sox, and lessons learned from Zack Scott. So Zack, thanks so much for joining. Always great to connect, and thanks for that fantastic perspective. Really appreciate it, and look forward to catching up another time.
All right, thanks, guys.
Welcome back to 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers. Julian, we just heard from Zack Scott about what it means to have a front office that's dealing with a lot of stuff, a lot of there's a lot of stuff swirling around the Red Sox front office and Red Sox decision making right now, as you would kind of expect in the aftermath of a trade the magnitude of Devers. To you, do you expect this to be a moment of organizational introspection for the Red Sox, where they kind of do take a step back and think about, we've gotten to a pretty strange point here and need to reconsider some of the things that have gotten us here?
I think so. I'm looking at and this is the first time for the Breslow where it seemed, and I know you said he was great as a player to talk to, but it seemed like there was this human element, really like a real human element to him during his press conference of just on Zoom, when he was just like, this was a failure in some sense, right? I don't think it was anything that they were trying to defend. I think it was something that they just were unfortunate from their behalf and on Rafi's behalf that they couldn't reach the alignment word that we've heard 13 times, as you mentioned.
The A word.
And I'm looking, yeah. And because it wasn't supposed to happen. I think in looking back, it did seem sort of salvageable. I listened to even what Pedro Martinez said about well, you guys could have brought us in, and I'm like, it may not have worked, but dang it, they probably should have just said, hey, guys, can you come talk to him, please? And it might not have worked. Who knows? But I think we're just looking at this, and they're looking and they're saying this was a failure. This wasn't supposed to happen. As we talked about, he was supposed to be paired with Bregman. That would have been one of the better 1-2 punches in the league. And it just happened so quickly. Like the Mookie thing, it sort of was like this slow drip kind of thing. But with the Raffy, it was like he's gone. And then and 5-6 months ago, you didn't even fathom he would be gone. So I think there has to be a lot of reflection on the Red Sox side.
Yeah, and I think that gets to some of what Zack was talking about when he said, the you don't regret, like it may be annoying to over communicate, but you probably won't regret it. Whereas a failure of communication can be a relatively devastating can have relatively devastating consequences. And so I think that this is going to be a very telling moment in time. And again, as we discussed with Zack and as you and I have discussed off the air, there are opportunities for organizations that seem like they're going down the wrong path to course correct. So this is going to be a really significant and meaningful time for the Red Sox as they define a path forward and figure out how to create a winning identity without Rafael Devers. How aggressive do you think that if they're in this middle, do you think, just quickly here, how aggressive do you think they'll be at the trade deadline building out if they're in this kind of like fringe contender spot?
I think Alex, we see a lot of what we saw over like the last three years. And to this point, I don't know if they had Raffy, I think it will be a little bit different of a position. They're like, okay, maybe we have to go out and get guys because we did tell our fan base, we did encourage our fan base that we would be contend this year. But that was before the Raffy trade. Right now, I know Breslin said they might win more games than they otherwise would with him, or that's in sort of what he said. And I just can't see that. And then I think unless they prove themselves in this next month plus, I don't see a reason for them to sort of go out there and get the guys that they would normally get if Raffy were there.
Well, there's the optimistic note that we always look to end on. No, I think that it'll be like this is going to be a crucial and telling time for the Red Sox coming out of in the weeks leading up to the trade deadline. Julian, thanks for helping to preview that. Always great to see you. And we will see you next time on 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers.